Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm so glad that you're here. I will be your host and facilitator today. My name is Jennifer Sanderlin. I'm an Education Partnerships Manager with Committee for Children. I am not the star of the show today. I'm not presenting, but I will be handling the chat box and welcoming you as I am right now, making sure I answer your questions and take comments. So I hope that you'll use the chat box. But first, I want to go ahead and welcome us to feeling safe and supported while learning at home. I am so proud to be helping host this webinar today because I think it's an extremely important topic, and we are extremely fortunate to have a very knowledgeable and expert person to join us today to present about it. So I'm going to turn off my video and invite Bridget to go ahead and say hello.
Hello, everybody. So I want to welcome you all to this webinar. This is a topic that's very close to my heart. Having been both a teacher and a school counselor, I just know how important it is to help kids feel safe and supported. My name is Bridget Normand. My role at Committee for Children is as a special advisor to learning and impact throughout the organization. And I just want to acknowledge that this moment in history is unimaginably challenging and really unprecedented in our lifetimes. And I know you all have had to turn around on a dime to figure out this learning at home. And that's as well as managing your own sense of safety and support while being at home yourselves. And perhaps many of you have children as well, so you're managing your jobs and your kids' jobs. And so you really have a sense of what a struggle it is for these children who are at home and for their caregivers who are trying to help them learn. So, a huge kudos to all of you for the incredible work you're doing. And I want to also say, I just hope you are getting feeling safe and supported and getting what you need while you do this very important job. So I'm now going to turn off my video and get started with the presentation. Okay, so my goals for today, you'll see on the screen here. I really want to identify the increased risks that students who have previously experienced trauma are facing during this pandemic. I want to identify what these students and their families specifically need during the pandemic to feel safe and supported, and really identify strategies and practices that you all, as educators, can use to meet those needs. So that's what we'll be talking about today. So let's start with just kind of level setting on adversity and trauma. This slide represents the situation in terms of adversity prior to COVID-19 pandemic. What we know is that 25% of young children in America were living in poverty, according to an analysis of U.S. Census data released in the fall of 2011. That's 1 in 4 American children. And poverty rates are worse for minority children. In fact, 3 times higher for Black children and almost 3 times higher for Hispanic children compared with white children. But now, of course, with mass unemployment and job loss due to the pandemic, we know the situation is worse. We can assume that currently the numbers are higher still, and that when we emerge from this health and economic crisis, these numbers will be continuing to go up. When I personally hear news stories of, as I have done recently, of 2,000 people being in line to pick up food from a food bank, we know that the numbers are much higher. And living in poverty is just one aspect of adversity. There is also a cluster of other adverse experiences that have become known as ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. This is the term that is used to describe all types of abuse, neglect, and other family difficulties that affect individuals under the age of 18. But there are also adverse community experiences. There's poverty, which we just talked about. There's housing instability, food insecurity, concerns about immigration status, structural racism, community violence, and so on. And no doubt many of you know that some of your students are dealing with both the adverse childhood experiences and the adverse community experiences, and that these are being exacerbated during this time. One result of having experienced or currently actually experiencing this whole range of ACEs is that children can experience what is called a traumatic stress. So child traumatic stress occurs when children or adolescents are exposed to traumatic events or situations, and this exposure overwhelms their ability to cope with what they have experienced. And so this is what, we all can experience trauma, but if we bounce back from it, we can move on with our lives. But when it's really overwhelming and you can't cope with it and you don't have the support you need around you, it can turn into this traumatic stress. What we also know that students who've experienced trauma are really found in every classroom, in every school, in every socioeconomic status bracket, in every ethnic and cultural group, at every age. All kids might, unfortunately, have had this experience of trauma. And so what is the impact of traumatic stress? This shows you some of the main things that can happen. For one thing, self-regulation decreases, or they struggle with it. They have a hard time managing their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Their behavior can become easily dysregulated and easily triggered by other events. And of course, a COVID-19 event can be a trigger for both overwhelming emotions but dysregulated behavior. And the result of both these things is that achievement can go down. So students who've experienced trauma and are living with traumatic stress are really at much higher risk of being further traumatized by the COVID-19 situation. And these kids will be more easily triggered by the situation that's going on and make it much harder for them to focus on learning at home and more reactive to their caregivers. You know these kids in your classrooms and how they can react to you as a teacher. And imagine when they're in this situation at home and they're feeling overwhelmed, and maybe the family, the caregiver is feeling overwhelmed. That can be kind of like a tinderbox for some very dysregulated behavior. So understanding this and having reasonable expectations of what students can or can't do in their current situation, and not putting undue pressure on students are barely coping, that is one thing you can do that could really make a difference. Adding academic pressure on top of everything can escalate the stress. And of course, I know many of you feel pressure to make sure kids are learning, but the reality is at this time, it may be very hard for some kids to learn. And I know that's hard for you as a teacher who has, you really want all your kids to learn and to learn at a high level, to accept that during this moment, that's going to be very hard for some of them. The pandemic is bringing a host of new and difficult experiences: fear and anxiety, loss of income, food insecurity, socialization, and so on. And that will inevitably increase family stress. And although sheltering in place may help to flatten the curve when it comes to COVID-19, home isn't always a safe place for everyone. During this time of uncertainty, we need to remember that increased stress in homes may lead to rising numbers of child abuse cases. The research indicates that economic uncertainty is associated with increases in harsh parenting, which of course may be a risk for child abuse. Due to school closings as a result of COVID-19, children will also potentially have an increased online presence and/or be in a position that puts them at inadvertent risk. Due to this newly developing environment, the FBI, in fact, has sent out a warning to parents, educators, caregivers, and children about the dangers of increased exposure to online sexual exploitation, and warnings about what to look for in case there may be signs of abuse. So this is, again, this whole thing that's going to increase. It is this likelihood of increased levels of child abuse and neglect, whether it's in the home situation or online. Losses of friends and family through illness and isolation can amplify all these stresses, and of course the heartbreak. and reduce the levels of support that caregivers are getting and children are receiving as a result. All of these would damage a child's sense of safety and have the potential to be traumatizing, and therefore increase the risk of child traumatic stress. And of course, all of these can also be traumatizing for the adult caregivers themselves and be triggering for those caregivers who have experienced ACEs in their own lives. So all of this really is amplifying during this moment. Before I continue, I just want to take a moment to explain some common stress responses that might emerge during this time. These are all things that we might notice in ourselves or notice in our students or their caregivers when we're communicating with them. And I think the important thing to note is that these are normal stress responses. So these stress responses including, physical, psychological distress, headaches, stomach aches, poor concentration, difficulty sleeping, and so on. They can be avoidance reactions like withdrawing, shutting down, avoiding talking about what's happening. And obviously increased emotions, such as increased levels of anxiety, irritability, anger or fear, and changes in behavior. You may find that there's some kids you're just having a hard time getting them engaged in your online learning, and this may be a stress response. And lastly, depressed mood or negative beliefs. So in your communication with students and their families, really notice if the students themselves or the caregiver is displaying or mentioning any of these. Let them know that these are normal signs of stress and encourage them to find ways to manage that stress. Sometimes just reassuring them that all of this is normal, this is the way most of us react when things are highly stressful, can be helpful. So that brings us to the question. Here's the picture I just painted. We know it's a really difficult picture out there for many families and children. So what can you do? I can imagine that as you're listening to this webinar, that there are students and families that you're really concerned about, that they just come into your mind as you hear me talking. And of course, it's natural to worry about them and wonder what to do. So let's move on to that. Let's talk about what are some things that you can do. This slide shows 3 practices that I believe are truly the ones to lean into at this time. These are ones that can help mitigate risk, perhaps reduce retraumatization, and provide deep support to students and their families. So as I move into this webinar, first I'm going to go through each one of these and explain what it is. And then I'll talk about how, by keeping them top of mind in your plan for home learning, they can help support the resilience of students and their families at this time. So let's start with trauma-sensitive practices. These may be ones you're already integrating into your school, and you're going, well, gosh, how do I do that with home learning? Let's just land on what these are, and then we're going to think about how to integrate these. The big idea that underlies trauma-sensitive practices is really about providing safety and support for students, which includes safe and supportive relationships. No student, but especially no student that has experienced trauma, can learn anything if they're not feeling safe and they do not have support. Another foundational practice is the implementation of an evidence-based social-emotional learning program. Students who have experienced trauma often struggle with self-regulation, and that includes emotion management and executive function. So learning those skills in particular and being with peers who practice them, and adults who model them, and a school culture that emphasizes them can make a huge difference. It kind of creates a sanctuary, it creates a holding place for children who've experienced trauma. Staff training is also critical. And this is about having all staff understand what trauma is, what the impacts of trauma are on children, and how to really see children's behavior through what I call a trauma lens. The trauma lens means that when students display dysregulated behavior, instead of asking, well, what's wrong with this kid? Why are they, throwing a tantrum? Why are they hiding under the desk? Whatever the behaviors might be, it's to really ask yourself, what have they experienced that is leading to them becoming dysregulated in this manner due to something in the school environment or the classroom environment that has triggered them. And they don't have, remember, they're overwhelmed. They don't have the resources to really manage their thoughts, emotions, and behavior in a way that's functional. So they get dysregulated very easily. And so part of trauma training is really understand that the behavior always means something. It doesn't mean it's a bad kid. It means something has happened to this child that they're not functioning in a way that's optimal. So training also needs to include how to respond to those behaviors in a supportive way, and in general, how to provide safety and support for these students. Preventing re-traumatization in the school setting is another key practice. And that means implementing bullying prevention and child protection programs so that when they come into school, they're not going to be a victim of bullying or experience other kinds of victimization in the school setting. And if they are experiencing some kind of abuse or neglect at home, they have trusted adults in the building that they can go to who will then protect them. So that's the first set of practices, trauma-sensitive practices. Another set of practices that I think are really critical and a core part of building a safe and supportive relationship with students is what are known as culturally responsive teaching practices. And this is truly about valuing and respecting students and their families, bringing that consistent, positive perspective to families, placing students at the center of instruction, placing their learning within the context of their culture. All of this really helps build those trusting learning relationships that are the cornerstone of culturally responsive instruction. And these trusting relationships provide a sense of safety and support. And as we've seen, that foundational safety and support is really a foundational building block for trauma-sensitive practices. So in the context of COVID-19, it's really to think about even more, what is the situation in the home learning? What is the culture that is happening in that home setting? And to bring that into your thinking as you plan your home learning. Now I'm going to tell you something that I came across while researching content for this webinar. I found it exciting and encouraging, and I wanted to share it with you. Studies of ACEs have shown that the higher one's ACE score, the higher one's risk of poor health and life outcomes. And that's been the powerful insight of the work on ACEs. So the question has arisen in the research field, are there positive childhood experiences that might buffer the impact of ACEs? A recent study looked exactly at that. The items on this slide are the 7 positive childhood experiences that adults were asked about in the study. Study participants were asked to report how often and how much as a child they had, 1, felt able to talk to their family about feelings. Number 2, how often they'd felt that their family stood by them during difficult times. How much they'd enjoyed participating in community traditions. How much they'd felt a sense of belonging in how much and how often they'd felt a sense of belonging in high school. How much and how often they'd felt supported by friends. How much and how often had they had at least 2 non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in them. And lastly, how much and how often have they felt safe and protected by an adult in their home. The study found that positive reports on any one of these 7 types of positive experiences were indeed associated with lower rates of mental health problems and higher rates of having relationships as an adult where you get the social and emotional support you need. And just like with the ACEs studies, when they counted up the number of positive childhood experiences, results show that just like the accumulation of adverse experiences, the more of these experiences an adult had, the more positive impact they had. In fact, the researchers found that having higher counts of these positive experiences were associated with 72% lower odds of having depression or poor mental health overall as an adult. And that's pretty significant in my mind. They also found that those with higher levels of positive experiences were over 3.5 times more likely to have all the social and emotional support they needed as an adult. So when I read about this, I went, wow, these positive childhood experiences are very powerful. Similarly, in another study on childhood flourishing, they found that children whose parents report being able to share ideas and talk about things that matter with their child had over 1,200% greater odds of flourishing compared to children for whom this was not the case. The research showed that talking about things that matter always meant talking about things that are uncertain, painful, scary, embarrassing, or difficult. And of course, COVID-19 is exactly that. It is a time of uncertain, painful, scary, or difficult things. So I would like to invite you just to take a moment with this slide here. I'll just pause for just a little bit to think about how you could use this information about positive childhood experiences during this time of home learning. Because I believe that each one of these could inform directly how you plan your home learning and how you interact with your students. These are experiences you could purposefully integrate into your online interactions or encourage with the activities you create. These are also things that you can encourage adult caregivers to do directly with their children, or you could do with them. So keep these in mind as we go through the next part of the webinar. So just take another moment to look at these. These are powerful. And you may be even reflecting at this moment in your own life and how much of these you had. And those of you who are parents, you can go, wow, these are things I really need to think about with my own kids. So the 3 practices that I'm suggesting in this webinar, trauma-sensitive practices, culturally responsive teaching practices, and these practices to create positive childhood experiences are really not discrete. As you've probably seen, there is very much overlap between all of these, but I think they're slightly different ways of looking at the same thing, and I think they amplify and extend and support each other. So another important thing to consider is that school is much more than just a place where academic learning happens. It can be a powerful source of these positive childhood experiences. It can encompass the following elements. It can be a sanctuary, a safe place, so that when students walk in the door, they immediately feel safe. It is a community of educators and families that children can belong to and participate in. It's a group of educators and other adults who care and show genuine interest in a child. It's a classroom and a school to feel that you belong to. And of course, it's a group of friends for play, fun, and support. Taking a trauma-sensitive approach, one that really helps buffer against adversity, I think means prioritizing these aspects of schooling as much, and perhaps even more in certain circumstances, than academic learning. Integrating these elements of school and thinking about them as you plan your online learning will protect children as much as possible from experiencing traumatic stress and help them return to school feeling connected, feeling supported, and ready to re-engage with academic learning. So as you plan your home learning, keep in mind all of these other aspects of school that are in addition to the academic learning. Because when kids think about school, they may think about learning, but they think about the adults that they trust, the children who are their friends, the fun things they do, the playground and lunch and games and that sense of safety. So I think these are things to really, really think about and make sure you're bringing into your online learning. And here's another thing that I think is also important, and I'm sure you've been thinking a lot about this. This won't be news to you. But schooling now includes homeschooling like never before. And now that school is no longer an actual place where everybody comes, it's critical to understand that with learning happening at home, the adult caregiver becomes your co-educator. And this is in addition to their ongoing role of providing primary safety and support for their children at home. So I think as an educator, it's important to consider how during this time you can both support the student directly, but also how you can support their caregivers so that they can in turn also support the student. And for students who are in home situations that are less than optimal, with caregivers that are under extreme stress, this notion of supporting both the student and the caregiver becomes a core trauma-sensitive practice. And of course, this is adding to what you need to think about as a teacher. But I think being thoughtful and kind of purposeful about this could really make a difference at this time. So I'm going to really walk through the rest of this presentation with both these people in mind, the caregivers and the students. So let's start with what kinds of support do caregivers need to be resilient? On this slide of things, we all need to be resilient at this time, but for caregivers who are already under stress that's being exacerbated due to COVID-19, these things are pretty critical. They need to feel safe. They need to feel connected, and this means really connected to you as their child's teacher. They need to feel accepted and valued in the role they're now taking on as both parent and caregiver and teacher. They need to learn and practice self-regulation, including emotion management, because the stress and the intense emotions are really happening right now. They need to avoid retraumatization if they themselves have experienced ACEs. And they need to receive targeted supports for their individual needs and for the COVID-19 situation. So here we go. What kind of supports do students need to be resilient? Well, as you look at this slide, you're going to go, oh, it's exactly the same list as the one we just saw. And that's, of course, no surprise because, as I said, these are things we all need to be resilient. But when we're dealing with students who've experienced trauma, just as I said with the one for the caregivers, these are really essential. So as I go on to the next slides in this webinar, I really want to go through each one of these items, these types of support, and suggest ways of providing support to both caregivers and students. And I'll be referencing our 3 practices as I go through. That's the trauma-sensitive practices, culture-responsive teaching practices, and how to create these positive childhood experiences. So safety is our foundational trauma-sensitive practice. And of course, according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it is also part of our most basic needs that include food and shelter. Learning will not happen if students do not feel safe. However, providing safety within a school building where you have control over the environment, can provide supportive rules and procedures, and high levels of supervision is one thing. Doing it at a distance when students are learning at home is quite another. However, I do think you can think about how to create psychological safety with your students. And here are some ways to do that. First and foremost is to be warm and friendly with your tone of voice, with your words, and the body language. Research shows that when you present in this way, it actually reduces a student's sense of threat. It stimulates their parasympathetic nervous system and is going to help them feel calmer. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system is called our rest and digest system, as opposed to our sympathetic nervous system, which is our flight-fight system. So we want children to be in that parasympathetic nervous system, where they feel rested and cared for and calm. And the way our biology works, if you use this warm, friendly tone of voice and face and body language, it will actually trigger that parasympathetic nervous system. Show that you care about students' well-being. So that means taking time to find ways to ask about that, and then to have kids know that you do, it really is important to you to know how they're doing. Provide multiple opportunities for caregivers and students to talk to you about how they're feeling and about the difficulties they're going through. As we saw, this is a really core positive childhood experience that really builds and helps with resilience and flourishing. So instead of worrying that you may be spending too much time on this, think about whether you're spending enough time, or at least providing enough opportunities in case students or caregivers really want to talk about what was going on or need someone to listen to how they're feeling. And this also means not avoiding the topic of COVID-19. This is one of these difficult, scary topics to talk about, and kids want to talk about it. This is the reality they're living right now. So find ways that are appropriate to do that without overdoing it, but let them know that you're open to hearing how they're doing around this as you go through your home learning. And lastly, create a consistent routine for students' home learning. You probably know that routine at school and in your classroom really helps children who can become easily dysregulated. They really rely on knowing what's going to happen and when. I think it's no different with home learning. So if you haven't yet been able to establish a routine, I really encourage you to do that and have kids really know this is what's going to happen at the beginning and this is what we're going to move to. You know, just them understanding so they can think about and know what their home learning is going to look like. The next thing to really think about is how to stay connected at a distance. And here are some things to think about. Frequent, actual, direct contact with students is foundational to this. If you could do it quickly every day with a text, that would be great. But if not, really think about how am I connecting with my individual students during the week. Give parents and caretakers a way for younger children connect with you and with their classmates if possible through, using online tools and apps. Visual connection, except of course in the case of students with visual impairment, will mean more to children than audio or online chatting. Sending them video messages of yourself can really help build this feeling of connection as well. But also keep in mind that some students may be sensitive to showing their home environments, in which case text or voice connection may be preferable. Or even giving them some creative suggestions about when you're on video with me, to cut out distractions, you may want to just sit with your back against a wall or in the corner of a room, and that'll give them the safety to be on video with you without showing their home environment at all. So these are just things to think about. This connection can take a form of check-in calls. And, connect directly with the caregivers. Give them their own frequent calls for their own support and to give them an opportunity to talk with you about how things are going at home. This will have a significant impact on parents' well-being, which will have a direct impact on their children's well-being. And of course, if there's a family with multiple kids in the school, to make it a little more manageable for everybody, you might want to agree with your teaching colleagues that there will be one teacher, maybe the one who feels they have a really good connection with the family, who becomes that main contact and then can relay information to you as the child's teacher. Helping students stay connected with each other is also important. We know that positive childhood experience is that support they get from peers. So how can you do that? Maybe it's learning buddies or study groups. Maybe it's, text chains. I know I've been reading all sorts of highly creative ways that teachers are figuring out how to help students stay connected with each other. And lastly, continue to see how important it is to be building these positive relationships with students and families. If a parent seems to be struggling in particular, make sure that they know about the National Parent Helpline, for example, which is a place that they can get emotional support from a trained advocate. So, we can perhaps add that to the follow-up email. Again, it's called the National Parent Helpline. One way to think about connection too is to think about your classroom rituals. They are very, very important, as I know you know, to building connection and community among your students. And they're foundational to safety and support. So take time to really imagine, and this can take some creativity, how can you bring these same rituals and routines into your online learning plan? So here's a short list of things to consider. How can you greet your students each day? I've read of teachers who've created text or video greetings, have started online journals that students add to each day. They found ways for students to share photos or videos of their pets or home projects with their fellow students. How can you do check-ins? How can you provide an opportunity for students to share how they are feeling? And remember, that's a very critical positive childhood experience. Check-ins can be by text. For example, you could have a ritual of students sharing by text their highs and lows, their yays and yucks, as some people call them, or even something fun that they've done during the day. And just as you would do in your classroom, see if you can do a classroom meeting. How could you reimagine that? So it's a time where they sit and really connect with each other. Make sure you add some really fun choice time or free time activities into your home learning plan. Again, creativity is the way to go here, I know there's lots of teachers putting out fabulous suggestions about the kinds of things kids can easily do at home that are really fun. And just like you do in your classroom, find ways to play games via video or send links to fun brain breaks that families and children can do together at home. And lastly, continue with your celebrations. Celebrate birthdays and other holidays as appropriate. This is all about creating and participating in community, which is another positive childhood experience. It also really builds belonging, and belonging in school is, again, another one of those, I'm going to call them PCEs, positive childhood experiences. Okay, moving on. This is where we can integrate the culturally responsive practices. Because when someone is truly valued and respected, then you also feel deeply supported and deeply safe. So culturally responsive teaching practices really integrate with trauma-sensitive practices and help build resilience. So here are some things to do. Display that genuine interest. And of course, we know genuine interest is also a PCE, a positive childhood experience. Show deep, judgment-free understanding of their unique home situations. And we know some of their home situations are going to be far less than ideal, especially if there's a loss of job, there's food insecurity, there's lack of support, there's illness, who knows? There's going to be some very difficult situations going on in the home. So really important to bring that judgment-free understanding to whatever the situation is. And if you need to adapt lessons and learning requirements to reflect what you know about those current life circumstances, make sure to do that. So for example, someone in the household is sick with COVID-19 and the parent is totally focused, or the caregiver is focused on taking care of that parent, really making the supportive accommodations for the children, just making sure they're safe, they have fun things to do, and not putting too much pressure on them to try and on their own, especially if they're young, to try and complete all their learning is going to make a big difference. Social-emotional learning is a foundational trauma-sensitive practices, and during times of social and emotional challenges, such as we're in now, obviously very critical. COVID-19 challenges us all emotionally, and emotions can range from fear and anxiety to frustration and loneliness. So learning to manage these emotions can be a daily challenge for us all, especially true for children who are still learning how to do this, and perhaps for caregivers who never had SEL at school and are struggling now to manage their own emotions. But we know that talking about difficult feelings and talking about what matters really is a PCE and helps build resilience. So our recommendation is to start by focusing on emotion management in your SEL lessons, even if you're repeating what you've already done. And focus on your own emotions at this time. It's like putting on your oxygen mask before you put the mask on the children. It really is a time to both model and talk about how you are doing and how you are coping. Part of regulation is often co-regulation, and co-regulation is defined as those warm, responsive interactions that provide the support, coaching, and modeling that children need to understand, express, and manage their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. All of us have times when we rely on co-regulation. When we are very upset, we will often reach out to a friend who will help us work through our feelings, listen to us, and help us calm down. So you, in your role, and caregivers in their role, really can add that extra layer of co-regulation so children do not have to do this all by themselves. And the younger the child, the more the caregiver will need to take up the bigger role in that. And as they get older, their role becomes smaller. But of course, when things are very stressful, they may have to step into a bigger role to help even adolescents with managing their emotions. If you can encourage caregivers to join in your SEL lessons so they and their kids can learn and practice emotion management strategies together, that would be great. It is a wonderful opportunity for them to learn together. I want to quickly just go through some Committee for Children resources for those of you who use the Second Step program. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but as you can see, we have there on the right, you'll see we have a dedicated COVID support page. In fact, if you go to secondstep.org, you'll see it in a banner right on the top. And one of the things we have provided is recorded K-5 emotion management lessons and the early learning weekly themes on emotion management too. And this is one of the live webinars we're providing. We're opening up our Mind Yeti, which is a mindfulness resource, for free for everybody. It's now on YouTube. If you go to mindyeti.com, you'll see that it's also available through podcast apps like Spotify and Stitcher. So again, this can be very helpful to help both you and the caregivers and the kids calm their minds and focus and connect. We have a new podcast that again is for kids and grown-ups called Imagine Neighborhood. And it really is based on social emotional skills, but features original stories, fun music, and helpful prompts for grown-ups and kids to talk about the big feelings we all have. Here are more resources around child protection. This is a resource to help families and educators talk with children about child sexual abuse. This may be useful during this time. And lastly, connect with us on Facebook. We have an educators community, and here you can connect with many educators dealing with issues similar to your own and ask them, what are you doing? And get their support. So returning to our list, we just now dealt with emotion management, coming back to the notion of preventing retraumatization. We've talked about, with children being stuck at home, that there's some potential risks. There's risk for sibling conflict and sibling bullying to increase. There's a potential exposure to increased levels of domestic violence or maltreatment. There's increased risk for online with cyberbullying from peers and online sexual exploitation. So this is where it becomes very important that you can maintain your role as a trusted adult for your students. And when you have these check-ins with them, no matter which way you do it, you check in how they're doing, it gives them an opportunity to let you know if any one of these things is going on in their lives. And of course, what is also true is that you are still a mandated reporter. And so if a child discloses to you during this time, you can still follow your school's reporting procedures. Because although you're not in the actual presence of the child, it doesn't change the actual content of the disclosure they have made to you, or how you should respond to it, or the next steps that you need to follow if it's something that needs reporting. So just know this is still a hugely important role you have that's a trauma-sensitive practice, because by reporting maltreatment, you can really change a child's life and prevent that re-traumatization. So again, these relationships, these check-ins, asking about how kids are doing are really foundational at this time. And this is our very last slide of content here. This is about providing targeted support. This may mean connecting caregivers to concrete resources like food, healthcare, counseling support if needed. You may need to connect them to your school counselor or social worker. It might be if you had a list of local resources to connect them to, that might be very helpful. You could perhaps get those from your school counselor or school social worker, just so that you have them at hand if right in the moment of a phone call or a check-in, you hear a need and can provide some resources. And for the students, really think about adjusting their learning activities to meet the needs right now and providing any appropriate accommodations, obviously for students that have IEPs, or you see that there really is a need right now because of what is going on at home. So here we are, this is the end, and we hope to have a little bit time for some questions. So the big takeaway is prioritize support. Really think about these 3 sets of practices, how they overlap with each other, support each other, and how you can really, very thoughtfully and purposefully plan them into your online teaching and the home learning. I know how hard and heartbreaking this time is. So again, please be sure to find the safety and support you need. You are on the front line and you are critical to the nation's children. So I send you a huge thank you. I am so grateful for what you do every day. And now it's time for some questions.
Well, thank you, Bridget. There are a lot of wonderful comments in the chat box telling you thank you. So I don't know if you can't see those.
No, I didn't. I was so focused. I didn't see any of them.
Yeah, that's okay. There are so many thank yous coming in. I think there were a lot of wonderful resources people hadn't ever seen before. So I was sharing those links along the way, and we will include those in the follow-up. I do have a couple of questions. I think some of the things that you talked about actually answered some of them. One of them was just wondering about the Imagine Neighborhood, what ages that's for, and I believe it's for age 4 through 8. Am I correct in that?
It's a 4 through 8, but we know that the stories have been designed to have both humor and content that can be appealing to older children as well. So I would say give it a try, see how your kids respond to it. And yeah, they're really fun, kind of wacky sense of humor with integrated music. And again, integrated into them are these times where we invite the children, now turn to your grown-up and talk about, whatever the theme of the story is. Our latest one was about a plague of pixies. So it was really a parallel to the COVID-19, and it really prompted kids to have some conversations with their parents about what it's like when you can't go outside because there's a plague of pixies. So I would give it a try, especially if there's children with different ages in a family. I think they could all enjoy it together.
Wonderful. I think you're right. So I did have a question about resources that you can think of would be specific for foster children, or ideas, I guess, around that, making sure you're connecting with that population.
I don't know of any specific resources, but I'm willing to bet organizations that really support foster children might have some. Again, I think these would be children who really, really need the support right now because they've come from, insecurity in their own lives and possible maltreatment, and so their risk of re-traumatization is quite high. So again, really, I think probably providing support to the foster parents and helping them so they know how to help their students. I think it has to be this two-pronged approach right now, supporting caregivers and supporting students.
I think you're right as well. I think this other question is a similar one, in just wondering about resources for students with ADHD, anxiety, depression with teenagers. I think this is probably something, at least from my own experience as well, just that as the kids get older, they're hearing a lot more of and consuming the news. So I don't know if you have any tips on that. I think all of the parents out there need help with teenagers in general, let alone during a time of a crisis.
And again, I think I would lean into the school social worker or counselor if you think there's families that need that additional support right now. Make sure the parents know about the helplines that are out there. And connecting with, now a lot of places have gone to telemedicine, so you can access regular therapists and counselors too. So I think really as a teacher, knowing what those resources are and knowing how to connect parents to them is going to be very important. What are your local resources? Where can they get some free support and counseling? How can they connect to these crisis lines or helplines? And again, really encourage them that it's okay to talk with kids about what's going on. In fact, it's really, really important. And to be sharing and listening to those hard feelings. And know it's normal. It's normal to be really perhaps having a tough time right now.
Very good. I agree. Let's see. I do have a few logistical things. People are asking about the resources we have on our COVID-19 page, a specific question about the link for the lessons in the Google Classroom. Just want to give everyone who is using Second Step, or whether you're not, even if you're not, if you would like to use the recorded lessons that we have for early learning to grade 5, you absolutely can use those in your Google Classroom. It does not violate copyright. We also have on that COVID-19 support page, which I'll put the link one more time, that also has a link to the permissions for copyright. So you can stream yourself doing those lessons if you like to. And that's all through June 30th, unless we decide to extend that. So no violating of copyright there. You're definitely welcome to use those. Let's see. Gosh, Bridget, there's so many great comments telling you what a wonderful presentation. I think that it was packed with so much information. Everyone is still kind of processing that. Let's see. One question, what are the best ways to reach out to families when they're feeling overwhelmed? What is the balance of reaching out and showing support, but also not making families feel even more overwhelmed by reaching out a lot? I would say that is something I experience as a parent of teenagers too. It's just that it's a lot for parents to take in, especially all of a sudden. So if you have any kind of tips on the balance of how that could be, if you make sure you're supporting, but not too much.
The first thing that came to mind, if you have a regular kind of routine of when you reach out to parents, so you could say, I just want to check in, every other day with every parent. So then you're not singling out any particular parent. And then also let caregivers know, and I'm happy to chat with you every day if that would be helpful. So you both, I think if you set up something that's very equitable among all your caregivers, so no one feels like, I'm taking up more time than other people, or they're particularly worried about me, to make it very neutral, but also offer additional check-in times, and really encourage people to reach out to you if they need more. But I think having that regular check-in is what is really critical.
There was another question about making sure to connect to preschoolers age 3 to 5, how you could sort of make those direct connections. Any tips or ideas on that?
It's going to have to be through the parent, through the caregiver. I don't have any specific suggestions except, you might, if you're texting the parent or doing a video call with the parent, have them bring the child to sit with them, and then you can have a direct chat with the child. And the parent, kids at preschool know how to use phones. So the parent could then step away and give you 5 minutes with the child themselves and then come back. You could even say to the caregiver, I just want to check in with Johnny for 5 minutes, come back in 5 minutes, and then we can finish the call then. I even video chat with my grandson, who's a year and a half, and he kind of knows how to engage with me on the phone. So I think that could definitely be one way.
That's true. They're pretty savvy these days. There's no doubt about that.
They know.
Let's see. I have I think maybe one last kind of regular question, and then I will do a few more of the logistics questions. One thing, I think this might be a good way to leave people is that these were mentioned from Rosemary, great ideas for teachers, but so teachers don't feel overwhelmed. What about teachers who've never used SEL before? What is the best or first place for them to start? What do you think if they have never used these resources or taught SEL, what would be one thing maybe you'd leave them with that they could suggest for teachers to do?
I think all teachers, and this is just completely off the top of my mind, read stories with kids. So one thing they could do is choose stories to read that have social emotional themes. So they get some support with a story and with characters, and then begin to talk to their own students about how did so-and-so in the story, what kind of feelings did they have, and how did you know, and what did they do to calm down? Or, I know there's various places where you can get book lists. We ourselves have, I don't know if they're accessible to people. So that is one way, is to come into it through something you're very comfortable with, like literacy. The other thing is to really, again, have these open conversations about how you're feeling, what you're doing, how are they feeling. And kids may know some ways that help them feel calm, like petting their kitty or sitting on their mom's lap or, whatever it be. So really, I would lean into, more than anything right now, identifying feelings, talking about what's going on, the emotion management, and perhaps find books that you know of, or you can, get links to online that you could read that have those themes.
Wonderful. That's great. So I'll just answer a few of the other kind of logistics questions. There were some questions about the resources that we have online. People have noticed that, or at least prior to today, they noticed that we had K through 5, but we do have early learning now. So that's actually posted and those are ready. And in fact, I was the one who led those lessons. So you'll see me if you do access those. As a former preschool teacher, that was a fun project for me to do. We also have a lot of questions about what to do as we begin going back to school or work. Many schools are not going to go back to school for the rest of this school year, but there may be some anxiety or things that come along as difficulty when parents are returning to work, and that young children as we kind of transition into the next step. And what I will say about that, Bridget maybe has a few nuggets, but what I will say about that is that I'm on the team that's working hard to come up with additional content for webinars in particular, but our entire team across departments, all of our organization is working on different resources for all of the various aspects that we can as we go into each stage of this pandemic, which we know we don't know what's going to happen when, but we do know that you'll need some resources. So we'll be working on those, and especially have an eye toward those transition times that we might see. And maybe we'll get Bridget back. That would be great.
Yeah, and I would just echo that, Jen. I know we're going to be turning our attention to that because we know it's going to be a huge need. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned. So I'll put the link for the webinars registration page on the chat box again. And so please kind of check back there. We do a once a month invitation, but if you don't see what you're looking for, we are always adding in new topics. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you, Bridget, so much for joining us today. This was really a wealth of information, and judging by the chat box, it was very, very well received. We're grateful to you and your time today. And we're grateful to all of you who are, whether you're teaching Second Step or you're working directly with students or not, we really always appreciate you joining us for webinars, and we hope that we'll see you on another webinar in the near future.
Yeah, and thank you for me. Again, as I said, this is a topic so close to my heart, and I am so grateful for all of you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Stay well, stay healthy, and we'll see you on the next one. Have a great day.